topics and opinions expressed in the following show are solely those of the host and their guests and not those of W4CY Radio, its employees, or affiliates. We make no recommendations or endorsements for radio show programs, services, or products mentioned on air or on our web. No liability, explicit or implied, shall be extended to W4CY Radio, its employees, or affiliates. Any questions or comments should be directed to those show hosts. Thank you for choosing W4CY Radio.
What's working on purpose anyway? Each week, we ponder the answer to this question. People ache for meaning and purpose at work, to contribute their talents passionately and know their lives really matter. They crave being part of an organization that inspires them and helps them grow into realizing their highest potential. Business can be such a force for good in the world, elevating humanity. In our program, we provide guidance and inspiration to help usher in this world we all want, working on purpose. Now, here's your host, Dr. Elise Cortez.
Welcome back to the Working on Purpose program, which has been brought to you with passion and pride since February of 2015. It's great to have you back. I'm your host, Dr. Elise Cortez. If we've not met before and you don't know me, I'm an organizational psychologist and logotherapist, speaker, and author. My team and I at Gusto now help companies to enliven and fortify their operations by building a high-performance, invigorated culture and leadership activated by meaning and purpose. Our mission is to help our clients create a destination workplace where people flock to join, are intrinsically motivated to perform at their best, can grow to their fuller potential, and are committed to stay and dynamically deliver on their company's mission, which translates to more satisfied customers and higher profits for you. You can learn more about us and how we can work together at gusto-now.com or my personal website, elisecortez.com. Getting into today's program, we have with us today Hunter Hastings, who is an economist who took up a career in corporate marketing and occupied the posts of Chief Marketing Officer in a global consumer products business, Chief Executive Officer in a Silicon Valley startup enterprise, and Senior Partner in a global consulting company. He has been an adjunct professor at Holt International Business School, the largest global graduate business school, and is the author of Aberrant Capitalism, The Decay and Revival of Customer Capitalism, which we're talking about today. He joins us today from San Diego. Hunter, welcome to Working on Purpose.
Hello, Elise. Thank you for inviting me. It's a great honor.
Quite happy to have you on, kind sir. As I told you before we got on air, I learned so much from this beautiful book you put out here. In the nice, crisp 79 pages of this book, you really did blow my mind. How's that?
Well, I'll try and maintain that.
Yes, I just really am delighted by what you have really helped me understand about how capitalism has evolved over the last 240 years, as you talk about it. And so we want to get to that here. What I want to do in this program today, listeners and viewers, is let him share with you some of the concepts from the book that help understand these different eras that he talks about in his book. And then really we're going to showcase what he puts forth, which is the promise of customer capitalism. And we'll get that in the last segment. But to kick us off here, we want to start with something that many people already know, and that is that capitalism has gotten a bad rap, especially among some of the younger generations. So let's start there. What's under that?
Yes, that's a problem to solve, that it's capitalism, as you say, has a bad rap. One of the data points we used was a 2022 Pew Research survey among 18 to 29-year-olds, and they asked how many of them would express positive sentiments about capitalism, and it was less than 40%. And how many would express positive sentiments about socialism, and it was over 40%. So we're underwater. And if you analyze that, Elise, we found that a lot of those comments are not about capitalism, the system, but about the corporations who implement capitalism. So we start our book off with the figure one, which is the growth of per capita income globally over the last couple of hundred years. And it's about 12x. So that's per capita real income globally for everybody in the world. And as you say, in the US, we tripled the per capita GDP over 50 years from the mid-18th century, or mid-19th century, to the start of the 20th. So capitalism has been good for everybody. It improves people's lives. In fact, that's what it's about. The purpose of capitalism is well-being, which we can express as customer value. And the customer wants to get from a situation they're dissatisfied with to one that they feel better about. And that's what capitalism helps them do. So we tried to dig into the corporation, and we can go through the three phases. I'm sure we will over the period of this recording. But at the beginning, the corporation was a brilliant invention of capitalism. So we start before the Industrial Revolution with the Wedgwood Company in Great Britain, which revolutionized the production of china, which was just becoming a thing in the world. You know, people were learning how to drink tea out of cups and cereal out of bowls. And it's a story of a growth corporation and a creative corporation, a marketing corporation, an innovating corporation. But it wasn't a corporation in the sense we see it today. It was a partnership of a couple of guys, and therefore was unable to grow at the scale that we think about today. So shift to the second half of the 19th century, and legal rules created the idea of the limited liability corporation. That meant that you could invest money in these growth corporations, and your loss was limited to the amount that you'd invested. So that enabled great entrepreneurs to create big companies. We talk about Standard Oil, we talk about Quaker Oats, we talk about Singer Sewing Machine. And Standard Oil is my favorite because John D. Rockefeller thought of what he was doing as what he called civilizing.
Yes.
Back in those days, candles and other forms of illumination are really expensive. Only rich people could afford them. And he brought kerosene, and he brought the price of kerosene down by about 30 times during a short period of time that everybody could afford. So he thought about families being at home, and instead of being in the dark, they could turn on the kerosene lamp, they could work in the barn, they could help the kids with their homework, they could spend family time together. That's what he thought about. That's a good example of customer capitalism. The purpose of capitalism was to improve people's lives. And of course, there were additional giant undertakings of customer capitalism, like transportation and communication and food. And Sears and Roebuck, Richard Roebuck thought of bringing the technology revolution to farmers in the countryside so that they could enjoy all of the benefits of the new tools and the new technologies. So really, until about the First World War, we could say that customer capitalism was the driving force. It was the driving entity. And there wasn't much stock market activity then. There wasn't much government regulation. These entrepreneurs drove these companies and created lots of benefit, lots of well-being from nothing. They built them up slowly, and they grew them by their own initiative and by feedback, by customers telling them what they wanted and what worked for them and what didn't. So that's what we think of as kind of the golden age of capitalism.
Yeah, and I found some of those stories really inspiring. I did actually capture Standard Oil, and I thought that I was really taken as somebody who helps organizations to detect and articulate their purpose and weave it into their culture. I have to share with our listeners and viewers what you cite in the book about what they claim here. So this whole notion that I can't even imagine that you think having to go to bed early because you don't have any light. So let's just go to bed. And so I love what you have here is that the Standard Oil business communication included this mission statement. It said, "I may claim for petroleum that it is something of a civilizer, as promoting among the poorest classes of these countries a host of evening occupations, industrial, educational, and recreative, not feasible prior to its introduction. And if it has brought a fair reward to the capital ventures in its development, it has also carried more cheap comfort into more poor homes than almost any discovery of modern times." Sounds good to me.
Well, it's wonderful. And back then, as we thought of it, business was a force for good. And of course, it still is. But we didn't have some of the developments that we'll talk about in the 20th century. But that whole era of growth, imagine, take that concept that you just read from Standard Oil and apply that across people's lives, the ability to communicate with each other faster, the ability to produce things with higher quality and greater speed, the ability to enjoy better, more nutritious, safer food. Just their lives are being improved at a great rate. It was a splendid time.
Right. But then we got to the next era. And the way you described this, Hunter, just was so, it was something that I could understand as a novice. This isn't my, economist speak is not my thing, but the way that you helped me understand how this changed so much. So once we got into the First World War, you introduced a few things that then altered capitalism for pretty much until today. So I want to talk about those things. I know there's the New Deal. I know there's the war economy. There is the War Powers Act. So there's a few things, if you could just kind of situate the start of that next era that really made the difference in capitalism.
Yes, yeah, I'd be glad to. So there's one critical transition, and that is that we describe the owners and leaders of these companies that we've just enumerated as entrepreneurs. I mean that in the economy sense, which an entrepreneur looks to customers, looks at what their needs and desires are, and tries to meet those needs and takes the reward of the marketplace for doing so. Once the entrepreneurs left, they either died or they moved on or they sold their companies, managers took over. So that's the first big transition from entrepreneurship to managerialism, as we coined the word. Now, that wasn't bad to begin with. We talk about a couple of instances. Procter & Gamble, which is my alma mater, invented the brand management system in the 1930s. So that was management, creating the idea that each brand was a business and it would know its customers really well and respond to those customers with innovations. And so managerialism wasn't so bad in itself, but then it became, after the First World War and especially after the Second World War, a control-oriented bureaucracy.
Yes.
Now, it came from the war economy, as you say, that started in World War I, where central government for the first time started to command the resources in the economy. They had to build tanks and ships and airplanes and conscript young people. And so that was a command approach. We will do it this way. We'll focus on these things. We'll run our projects at this speed. A lot of the people who were on those committees, on those war boards, moved into the private sector. And so that was one big step. Meanwhile, government had intervened in the Great Depression and said, boy, we can't have depressions. Capitalism must be controlled from the center. And so we got all of those committees and the kinds of boards that Franklin Roosevelt put up to, again, command and control the economy. The Second World War intensified that. So the Great War economy then became the blueprint for post-Second World War corporate management. So those people went to run GE and IBM and companies like that with that central control kind of idea. Mm-hmm. So that became management. It became what corporations do. And there's a passage we use in the book, and I enjoyed researching it, about Reginald Jones, an Englishman, who was CEO of GE. And what the managers called the central control was strategic planning.
Yeah. And
so they had strategic planning units, strategic business units. Reg had about 40 of them at one point. And he said, well, that's too many. So we'll add 10 more, but they'll sit on top of the 40 we've already got. And then finally, at the end of it, he said, we have too much strategic planning. I don't even know what we're doing. So management kind of destroyed itself, and that led to slow growth. It led to the bureaucratic sclerosis, where you've got people working in the corporation not for the customer and not for effectiveness and not for innovation, but for efficiency and cost control. And that became the norm for a long time in the US.
Yeah, and so I certainly recognize that, and the way that you describe it in the book, I think of the really, really large organizations, and to me they scream still command and control and bureaucracy. And but the idea, though, this was pretty interesting to me too, though, that the idea then that when you got into the post-war capitalism, you got into the age of control. But the way that you talk about that was really arresting to me. And you say within the company, the tool for control and power was accounting, which was no longer a passive function of counting, reporting, but rather an aggressive function for the relentless pursuits of efficiency and profit. That really brought home to me a lot of how I experienced the companies in that time period.
Yeah, so this idea of command and control, as you say, Elise, became aggressive control. We must control and manage those people out there in the corporation. This is the bureaucrats in the central planning units talking, because otherwise they'll waste money, or they'll execute projects badly, or they'll do things that we don't approve of. And so you got all these rules, you got all of these processes. And one of the movements in post-war capitalism was what they called BPM, business process management, which meant every process in the corporation will be documented, will be controlled. Each step will have a gateway, and you'll have to get through the gateway and report to a senior executive on each of that and ask for approval for the next step, and so on. It just became absolutely sclerotic in a very negative way. And then the next element of that is financialization. And what we mean by that is that the finance sector, which includes the bureaucrats inside the corporation doing finance and accounting, and the financial sector outside doing stock trading and managing bond issues and doling out capital, became more of the focus of the corporations than the customer did. So I'm now managing for the financial sector. That includes things like quarterly earnings. I've got to hit my target every quarter. Well, one way to do that is don't spend any money on R&D, spend it all on managing earnings.
Right.
And Jack Welch of GE became kind of the living embodiment of that. He was well known for earnings management, which is you always hit your targets and maybe you go over by a penny or two so that you can say that you beat the target. And he created pools of cash and revenue inside the corporation to feed into earnings at the end of the quarter. It was pretty well known on Wall Street that he was doing that. But the point is that the financial sector took over the focus, and the customer lost that focus and wasn't as well served. There's
Before we go on there, Hunter, let's take a quick break because I want to really delve more into that. There's a couple of things that are specifically interesting to me about that period. So hold that thought if you would. Let's grab our first break. We've been on the air with Hunter Hastings, who is an economist who took up a career in corporate marketing and occupied the posts of Chief Marketing Officer in a global consumer products business, Chief Executive Officer in a Silicon Valley startup enterprise, and Senior Partner in a global consulting company. We've been talking a bit about how he has begun narrating the evolution of capitalism. After the break, we're going to talk more about the age of financialization and go on to the way forward. We'll be right back.
Dr. Elise Cortez is a management consultant specializing in meaning and purpose, an inspirational speaker and author. She helps companies visioneer for greater purpose among stakeholders and develop purpose-inspired leadership and meaning-infused cultures that elevate fulfillment, performance, and commitment within the workforce. To learn more or to invite Elise to speak to your organization, please visit her at elisecortez.com. Let's talk about how to get your employees working on purpose. This is Working on Purpose with Dr. Elise Cortez. To reach our program today or to open a conversation with Elise, send an email to Elise, A-L-I-S-E, at elisecortez.com. Now, back to Working on Purpose.
Thanks for staying with us and welcome back to Working on Purpose. I'm your host, Dr. Elise Cortez, as I too am dedicated to helping create a world where people realize their potential at work and are led by inspirational leaders that help them find and contribute their greatness. And we do business that betters the world. I keep researching and writing my own books. So my last one came out in March of 2023. It's called The Great Revitalization: How Activating Meaning and Purpose Can Radically Enliven Your Business. And I wrote it to help leaders and business owners understand just how much the workforce has changed. What do they want in order to give their best? And then I offer you 22 best practices to build in your culture to help create that for them. You can learn more about it at my website, gusto-now.com or Amazon. If you are just now joining us, my guest is Hunter Hastings, and he's the author of Aberrant Capitalism, The Decay and Revival of Customer Capitalism, which we've been talking about today. So you were about to say a bit more about this period of financialization here, and then I also wanted to talk about this notion of the government being the customer.
So the financialization era saw the financial sector grow in influence and power relative to the productive sector. There's a Bank of International Settlements paper that we quote in the book that maps this out. It shows as the financial sector gets bigger, the productive sector gets smaller. More and more people are employed in the financial sector, fewer and fewer in the productive sector. Money goes into stock trading and dividends and stock buybacks and less into R&D and those kinds of functions. And so there's a data support for this idea. But one of the driving elements that transformed financialization in the latter part of the 20th century was this idea of maximizing shareholder value.
Yes.
A lot of people attribute that to Milton Friedman's famous article in the New York Times, where he said the only purpose of a corporation is to make a profit. And that's okay, because what he meant by that was that profit's a good thing, and that gets reinvested in all kinds of directions. And so it's a signal from the market that the customer approves of what you're doing and how you're using resources. But the financial sector didn't take it that way. They created this maximizing shareholder value idea, which is that's what the corporation should do, not maximize customer satisfaction, but maximize shareholder value. Obviously, you've got to have a customer, because the customer pays, and that cash flow eventually goes to shareholder value. But it's the diversion of resources that is the problem. So dividends, stock buybacks, and the lack of investment in places like R&D and experimentation and innovation, that's been well documented. And this maximizing shareholder value became a real detriment in how we thought about capitalism, about how corporations were managed. I think with stakeholder capitalism,
yes, that's where I was going to go to,
the movement that you're involved in, conscious capitalism, we're trying to soften that a little bit, but it's not a solved problem yet.
No, it really isn't. And then I went on, this was really interesting here. Well, I also want to add that how you describe the maximization of shareholder value, it's a subtractive management model. I thought that was very, very, very interesting to hear you describe it that way. And it seemed that way to me as well. But then you also went on to explain, interestingly enough, that in this environment of high and increasing regulation, corporations can be seen diverting resources from the end user and customer, as you've been saying, and redirect them to government as the customer. And this is where it gets really interesting for me. You go on to say this shift is evidenced by an increased allocation of resources to lobbying efforts. And you say careful investment in a Washington lobbyist can yield enormous returns in the form of taxes avoided or regulations curbed, the basis of the economics of lobbying. That's scary. That's scary to me. It really is, the power of that.
Yeah, it is. And in fact, we're in a dangerous situation, Elise, where the entanglement, as we call it in the book, of corporations and the government is at a pretty high level now. So these big companies obviously have the government as a customer. If you look at Microsoft and Amazon and those kinds of companies, they do projects for the government in the billions of dollars in the defense area and research areas and so on like that. Customers or companies like Palantir is another one with huge government contracts. So that's one area. The second is this increasing regulation of industry by the government, this feeling that we have in our current state of capitalism that it must be regulated. There are more regulations every day. There are hundreds of thousands of pages in the Federal Register. And corporations have come to accept that. In fact, one of the big bureaucratic departments is compliance. How do we comply with all these regulations? And then it becomes, hey, let us write the regulations. And that will favor the incumbents, the big pseudo-monopolistic companies, and maybe shelter some of our industries from incursion and disruption and innovation by smaller companies. So that has been well tracked. And a lot of the lobbying companies actually write the regulations. They take them to the Congress people or the bureaucrats in the government. They co-develop them and then get them approved. So that's a pretty well-known industry. It's a big industry. that quote that you mentioned is from Jeffrey Birnbaum, who's a much deeper analyst into government entanglement than I am, but that's clearly a decision. That there was a famous observation that Google, which used to have no lobbying presence in Washington, D.C. in its early days, now has the biggest lobbying presence in Washington, D.C. and in Sacramento and other state capitals. So it's really become a big industry of let's write these regulations together because they're for both of us.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for explaining that. It's just, there's just so much dearth there. So now that we've thoroughly, frustrated and maybe depressed our listeners and viewers, let's bring them back up and talk about the way forward, a brighter future of capitalism. And so, we've been talking about these realities of financialization, bureaucracy, the failures of management theorizing, the destruction of entanglement of corporations with government, the uselessness of prevailing economics, and the distorted purpose of the corporation. So now we've surfaced all that, and you do a beautiful job of explaining that to us as to what happened. And I think the progression over time really helps us understand it as well. So now we have the promise of customer capitalism. Mm-hmm. In the digital age, no less. So let's start talking a bit about that promise.
Well, there's a new magic business model, Elise, and that is direct connection to the customer. So the theory of customer capitalism is customer sovereignty, or consumer sovereignty, to be accurate. That comes from a lot of mid-century economists who are looking back at the era that you and I were just been talking about and said, really, the customer's boss. The customer decides what is produced. The customer decides which firms are successful. The customer sends the message to the firms. And that was true. Then it ceased to be true because of everything we've just been through. But this new magic business model of direct connection to the customer is going to change everything, because Amazon's a simple example. There are many more, but I can go to Amazon as a customer. I can click on what I want to buy. That's an instant piece of information for Amazon. It says Hunter or Elise likes this. I can derive some patterns about what they want. If I make comments about satisfaction, they can react to those, and very, very quickly in the digital age, they can revamp the production, the inventory, the response rates, the advertising, the marketing, in response to the customer. And the firms that are doing that at the highest and most sophisticated levels are the ones that are starting to win today. Tesla's another great example, because every second you're driving, the car has its 24 sensors and cameras, or however many there are, probably a lot more than that now, and constantly gathering information so that eventually, the ultimate in sovereignty, that car can be self-driving. And that's the business model: direct connection, a flow of information, the analysis of those patterns so we can derive an understanding of the customer satisfaction, and then the constant improvement cycle, which can move at great speed. So with that at its heart, I think there is a lot more customer capitalism to come in the digital age. I'm very excited about it.
Yeah, I am too. I'm really excited about that. And I appreciate it too that you also said somewhere in here that right now, only about 15% of companies would be described as operating in this new fashion that you're talking about, that we've been talking about. We'll talk a bit more about. Is that right? So do I have that right? 15%?
Yeah, it's a guess or an intelligent estimate, hopefully, Elise. And really, it's looking at the biggest corporations where we can see inside them and understand what they're doing. So we've talked about Tesla, we've talked about Amazon. There's some interesting businesses not typically thought of by U.S. customers. There's a business in China called Haier, H-A-I-E-R, which has changed its management model to be entrepreneurial. So it doesn't have a big central planning unit. It doesn't have hierarchical control. Every business unit is entrepreneurial, and typically it's about 50 or 75 people. It's entrepreneurial in the sense of, they call it closeness to the customer. They have an expression in Chinese which translates as zero distance to the customer. So how can I know the customer? They make a lot of appliances, for example. They acquired GE Appliance in this country, so we'll see if they can apply it, make that model work here. But the model is understand the customer, translate that into new products and innovations and service as quickly as possible, zero bureaucracy, zero overhead. There are a few central planning units in terms of marketing that might be spread over several of these entrepreneurial units, but it's a whole new way of thinking about doing business. So very entrepreneurial, just like we talked about in the 19th century. There's another model out there with a little company called Handu, which makes consumer wearables and consumer goods that can be ordered on the internet. And it's got lots of those little front ends, typically 3 people, a product person, a designer person, a marketing person. They're selling through e-commerce on the web. That data comes back, goes straight to a data layer. It doesn't go through any bureaucratic layers. And then to the back end of the factories, which respond quickly with new ideas and new manufacturing. So they call that digitally enabled autonomy. So we're getting away from managerialism and all the way to not only customer sovereignty, but autonomy of the frontline people who are closest to the customer. So there are really some exciting new business models coming out, and I think there's a lot of promise there for the future.
I think so too, and I'm a fan of promise. Let's, on that note, let our listeners and viewers think about what we've been talking about here. Let that settle in for just a smidge as we take our last break here. I'm your host, Dr. Elise Cortez. We've been on the air with Hunter Hastings, who is an economist who also took up a career in corporate marketing over the years. He's done a lot of things with various companies. We've been talking about his book, Aberrant Capitalism. After the break, what we're going to do is we're going to spend that time focusing on showcasing some of these really best-in-class practices that these newer companies that Hunter's talking about are doing to move themselves forward. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Dr. Elise Cortez is a management consultant specializing in meaning and purpose, an inspirational speaker and author. She helps companies visioneer for greater purpose among stakeholders and develop purpose-inspired leadership and meaning-infused cultures that elevate fulfillment, performance, and commitment within the workforce. To learn more or to invite Elise to speak to your organization, please visit her at elisecortez.com. Let's talk about how to get your employees working on purpose. This is Working on Purpose with Dr. Elise Cortez. To reach our program today or to open a conversation with Elise, send an email to Elise, A-L-I-S-E, at elisecortez.com. Now, back to Working on Purpose.
Thanks for staying with us and welcome back to Working on Purpose. I'm your host, Dr. Elise Cortez. I mentioned in the last break that my last book, The Great Revitalization, came out in March of 2023. What I did for you is I created a 3-page assessment that you can take off my site, gusto-now.com, and that will help you understand the extent to which your current culture is meeting the needs of today's discerning workforce. If you are just now joining us, my guest is Hunter Hastings. He's the author of Aberrant Capitalism, The Decay and Revival of Customer Capitalism, which we've been talking about today on the program. So for this last bit of our segment here, Hunter, I really want to focus on the management practices and the characteristics of some of these more forward-thinking companies that are in this new era here, so that our listeners and viewers can start thinking about how can they fold this in their own organization. So you list, it looks to be like about 8 or so different practices that these organizations, especially Tesla and SpaceX, are using as management practices. So I want to kind of walk through as many of those as we possibly can. Mm-hmm. I'm happy to cue them up, or if you just want to talk about the ones that are most important. But I'd like to cover all of them if we can.
Well, walk us through them, and I'll try to elucidate each one.
Perfect. Okay. First one is an extremely flat organization.
Right. So the great theory of management and structure and organizational planning in the 20th century has been the hierarchy, that you've got a boss, you've got different layers, the orders come from on high and they work their way down to the people at the front line. And that in itself is a problem. It slows down the flow of information. It's slow decision making. It is a lot of waste. So One of the things that Elon Musk has done is try to eliminate a lot of layers. The goal would be to get to a completely flat kind of corporate organization. But management per se then doesn't take place. Everybody is creating value.
Right.
They're connected, they're integrated. There might be somebody who's got the most knowledge about this particular problem at this point in time, then that person, her or him, is in charge. They're the leader at that stage. But that's flexible and dynamic. So with the help of technology and networks and AI, we can do that today. So flat versus hierarchical is the goal.
Okay, so this next one's going to really be really frightening for several people that are listening to this, especially if they are in more of a traditional human resource capacity. And that is this notion of assembling teams, cross-functional teams that are flexibly deployed so that individuals can leave and join freely based on the needs of the team and the task at hand for specialized expertise. And here's the part that's going to scare them a lot. There are no job descriptions to limit the potential contribution of individuals. That sounds like holacracy to me, actually, the practice of holacracy.
Well, holacracy has been a good attempt in the direction that we're trying to go in. It's run into some problems, but there's a famous company in Northern California called Morningstar. It's a global company now.
Mm-hmm.
It's one of the case studies, and they don't have job descriptions. They have undertakings between individuals. You and I have to work together, Elise. So here's what I'm going to do, and you approve that. Here's what you're going to do, and I approve that. And we review that constantly. And the other part of that is that we used to being organized in divisions and departments. I'm in the marketing department, you're in operations, and so we never see each other, we never get together. If you organize functionally, we need to build a brand. That brand is built on customer satisfaction. Customer satisfaction might be a nice creative ad, so I can talk persuasively about what we do for the customer, but it's also excellence in operations. It's making the product perfectly, it's delivering it on time, it's meeting expectations that way. So in that sense, the operations and marketing are on the same team. So let's have a team of customer satisfaction or a team of brand building, and we're all on it together, we're all connected through the network, and we both have that responsibility. It might not be the only thing I do, so I work on several of those teams. And that we're slowly figuring that out. I think that holacracy was an attempt. In fact, it was a bit too structured, and now we're finding this idea of dynamic, constantly rotating, constantly changing teams is starting to work.
It sounds really exciting to me. There's several other ones that we could talk through. Let me just pick the ones that I think are really most interesting. So this next one that I want to have you talk to, please, is the short-term problem solving over long-term planning.
Yeah, so this goes back to financialization to a great extent. We talk about quarterly earnings, and that becomes your mindset. That means meeting the monthly sales goal and hitting the weekly sales goal. And when I was working in a corporation, I was the one who went and got the daily sales from the computer. So you can manage in the short term, and you cut the budget if you're not making sales and so on like that. Whereas true value creation is thinking about the long term. How can I serve a customer for the longest period of time with innovation, with change, but constantly elevating their life and not thinking about earnings this week or this month or even this year, but thinking about the long-term value that I'm creating for the customer. And so a lot of companies are starting to think that way. They're still repressed by the financial sector demanding these reports. So we've got to figure out how to release them from that. One way will be a different relationship with the financial markets. So private equity, which has a bad rap historically because of some of the things that it's associated with, is now starting to develop the idea of patient capital. We'll invest this money in your innovation in your firm. We're not going to demand quarterly earnings. We're not going to demand a report at the end of the year, but we're going to look for a big return in 7 or 10 years' time. So we'll be patient capital, and we'll look for the growth of the corporation, the growth of its purpose, and the growth of its innovation, but we're not going to demand those short-term benchmarks. So that's an interesting new relationship with capital. It's not the stock market, but it's still capital coming from financial markets. So there's a lot of new things happening in that relationship too.
Just a quick segue here, I've learned, and you'd be a perfect person to ask this. There's just a couple of long-term stock exchanges that have been established. What's your view on them, their role, and their contribution?
Well, yeah, I think that's an example of the financial sector thinking in these terms as well.
Mm-hmm.
There are some options that you can buy that have long terms. Obviously, the bond market tends to be longer term. You can buy 10-year and 30-year bonds. And so this general approach, Elise, of thinking long term, not short term, not trading stocks, but investing and thinking for the long term, it's beginning to turn. It really is beginning to turn.
I'm happy to hear that. Let's just talk about two more of these management aspects here before we go on to the characteristics that I think are interesting. Anyway, this notion of having middle management being eliminated and replaced by AI to provide real-time information about the implication of employee actions for the corporation's mission and goal. That's fascinating. Really, really fascinating.
Yeah, we don't really know where AI is going, but a lot of people are thinking about this, create the vision of, I'm on a team. One of my friends call it Homo sapiens and digital sapiens. So I've got a human. The human can do things that only humans can do. It can have empathy. It can be creative in different ways, can imagine things in the way that AI can't. But hey, for data analysis and process management and so on, maybe I've got the AI on my team as well. And so we'll be working in teams to do that. One of the fascinating ideas in that concept is the AI CIO. Your boss will be the AI, but you'll still be doing interesting work and serving customers and so on like that. So we don't really know where it's going to go, but certainly that kind of organizational flexibility, the digital world and the human world coming together, I think that's a real possibility. And it certainly won't be vertical, it'll be horizontal. It'll be each of us working with an AI assistant and working on teams and being connected that way. So that's another way that middle management is going to go away. And if you remember that's what Elon Musk tried to do at Tesla and then at Twitter when he got there, or now X. And he said, if you think carefully, there's not a lot of stuff that needs to be done by middle management. You can eliminate it. So, that's not being nasty to people. It's being nasty to the way that organizations were structured in these hierarchical, vertical organizations, and we don't need it anymore.
Right. I totally get that. Well, since we're getting close to the end of the time, let's go ahead and move on to a few of these interesting. You talk about the newly imagined pattern of management exhibits these characteristics. And so there's a few that are fascinating to me. First, principles, not rules. That sounds really good to me as somebody who is not a big fan of rules.
Right. So at the company I mentioned before, Morningstar, the guy who started it, Chris Rufa, started on the basis of principles, and he had two. And everything is collaboration. There's no coercion, and you build from there. So what are the principles, the long-term truths on which you're going to build your business? You talk about purpose, and that's one of those principles. Yes. We all share that purpose, and then you can figure out what we all do within that purpose. So there's a concept coming up now. Instead of job descriptions, you have role mapping. In this particular situation or this particular area of what we're doing, what's my role? What's your role? How do we map it all together so that things get done properly? So we have role mapping as a replacement for other forms of organizational design.
Okay. Yeah, you do talk about purpose. I also, of course, that's my jam here. And then the next one that's interesting too, of course, which we've been talking about this whole time, the customer is the business model. That's obviously something we've been echoing here. And then this is really interesting. Revenue growth and profit are emergent outcomes.
Right. So the word emergence a bit technical. It comes from complex systems science, which is a growing science, which is very relevant to what we've been talking about today. That systems are areas of interaction of individuals, like people and parts of the corporation, from which results emerge. Now you can guide them, you can constrain them, you can point them in the right direction, but you can't always predict what's going to happen. But one thing we do know is that if we serve customers, cash flow will be emergent from that, right? They'll pay for the value that we're giving them. And out of that comes profit, comes reinvestment. But if we focus on this one idea, the customer is the business model, we know we're creating value if they pay for value. That's the pivot point, that you turn subjective value into cash, and then that cash comes flowing through the organization, and we can allocate it appropriately. So this long-term idea of we're creating value, and our pivot point is that people pay for value, and that's everything else follows from that.
Love that. And now then we bridge onto this here, because this is really fascinating for me, especially because of the work that I'm doing. This idea of subjective value and empathy. You go on to say the determination of value in this new model lies entirely with the customer. Value is subjective, determined by the customer's feelings and identified in their mental evaluation. Therefore, a core skill for the corporation today is empathy. The ability to diagnose customer feelings, how they make choices, and how they develop the mental models that determine those choices. Empathy is not a process that can be mapped or automated at a cultural orientation. Is not, that can be, but it can be nurtured. Sorry, and that's the important thing. It can be, so more empathy companies succeed. So I think that is really, really critical. I do champion that a lot in my work that I'm doing with my culture building. So I have to say, Hunter, when I heard that economists champion this, I knew I was in the right lane.
Also, there's subjective value is a concept in economics. It's the number one concept. The purpose of the economy is to produce subjective value. Now, what does that mean? It means it's entirely in the head of the customer, the consumer. It's a feeling, it's an experience.
Mm-hmm.
And to get a little bit more technical, they listen to your value proposition. Hey, here's how I'm going to benefit from, deliver a benefit to you. If they buy, they then experience what you propose to them, and then they evaluate it. So the value comes after the experience. And if they like it, they'll continue. If they don't, they won't. So that is the whole purpose of economics. Now, if it's in the customer's head, how can I understand that? And the technical term for that proposal is empathy. And empathy is trainable. We can get better at it.
Yes.
One of my colleagues talks about building their mental model. How did they think? And then if I run my value proposition through their mental model, I'll understand if it does create value or if it doesn't. And here's something wonderful, Elise. I was looking this up the other day before I talked to you. If you Google, I shouldn't say Google, if you research Apple's marketing philosophy. And in 1977, Steve Jobs and Mike Markkula wrote it down, and proposition number one is empathy. We will understand our customers better than anybody else. We will understand how they feel. We'll understand their motivations, and we will live up to that and deliver value. So Steve Jobs and Mike Markkula understood that in 1977. But it is the number one skill in business. You might not learn it in business school. You'll learn it as an entrepreneur. And the better you are, we call it empathic diagnosis. There's a fancy term for it. But if you can diagnose what's driving the customer and then meet them on their own grounds by delivering value to them. So we've got to find a way as economists to improve this word value. We think of it as subjective value. The people who thought about maximizing shareholder value obviously didn't think about it that way. So we've got to find that right term. My term is well-being. People seek well-being, and we'd like to deliver well-being.
It works for me. Well, it has been a delight to read your book, to learn from your book, to be connected to you, and have you and share you with my listeners and viewers across the world. What would you like to leave our listeners with today?
Well, that we're entering a great new hyper-entrepreneurial era. And by entrepreneurship, I mean understanding customers' needs, as we've discussed, and then creating innovations to serve those needs better. I think we're going to eliminate a lot of waste that is in bureaucracy and financialization, and the world will become a lot better because we make customers' lives better one step at a time, and that's through entrepreneurship. So I think everybody should be an entrepreneur in some role or another, and everybody should be a value creator. That's what I'd like to leave them with.
I am right along there with you, Hunter. That's the world that I want to live in. Thank you so much. What a beautiful way to finish.
Thank you, Elise. Thank you very much for inviting me today.
Very welcome. Listeners and viewers, you're going to want to learn more about what Hunter Hastings is doing, his work as an economist or as a corporate executive, and his book, Aberrant Capitalism. So you can visit thevaluecreators.com as a website. That's a place to start. You can also find him on LinkedIn. Last week, if you missed the live show, you can always catch a being recorded podcast wherever you get your podcast. We were on air with Pam August of the firm Connecting Potential, where she guides organizations, teams, and leaders to unlock potential that is already there for the transformational results. We talked about the framework she offers in her new book, Potential, how to connect what's already there for exponential impact to completely elevate your own potential and across your organization. It was fabulous. Next week, we'll be on air with Karen Golden-Biddle talking about her book, The Untapped Power of Discovery, how to create change that inspires a better future, where she teaches us how to embrace discovery as an everyday habit to unlock all manner of new innovation and keep the ideas we launch getting the traction they merit. See you there. And remember that work is one of the best adventures and means of realizing our potential and making the impact we crave. So let's work on purpose.
We hope you've enjoyed this week's program. Be sure to tune into Working on Purpose, featuring your host, Dr. Elise Cortez, each week on W4CY. Together, we'll create a world where business operates conscientiously, leadership inspires impassioned performance, and employees are fulfilled in work that provides the meaning and purpose they crave. See you there. Let's work on purpose.